We continue now at the top of Daf Amud Aleph and Mesechet Yevamos. This is Yevamos Daf 20a. The Gemara is discussing the situation of Eishes Achiv Shelo Haya Ba'olamo, and specifically discussing the position of the Rabbanan. The position of the Rabbanan is that, let's say the first brother dies, and then his wife does Yibum with the second brother, and then after his wife does Yibum with the second brother, then the third brother is born. So it's still going to be a problem of Eishes Achiv Shelo Haya Ba'olamo, even though at this point in time, before this third brother was even born, this woman had already done Yibum with the second brother. You would think that the marriage to the first brother is completely irrelevant. And so the Gemara said, no, it's not totally irrelevant, because Adayin Yibumin Harishonim, the original Yibum, is still really upon her. So the Gemara says, is that really true? But we say over here, Shemegar Shebeget, that really it's not true. By the second husband already, when the second husband, when he does Yibum, so he divorces her with a get. In other words, it's a full-fledged regular wife. There's no chalitza involved whatsoever. As Rashi over here says, Shemegar Shebeget, Ve'ena Tzricha Chalitza, there's no need for chalitza. V'im Ratza lahachzir machzira, and if he wants to remarry, can remarry. V'lo amrinan mitzvah ramya rachmana aleh v'avda. We don't say that he did. There was a mitzvah upon him and he did it. Or mehashta teiku aleh be'isrei shasach. We don't say now that there's an isrei shasach. In other words, you might suggest that in this particular case, if there's no yibum anymore around, so there's no more yibum, now it's shasach. It's a situation where she was the wife of the brother, but that's not true. We say that this refreshes the entire thing, so to speak, and at this point in time, he can divorce her with a get umachzira, and he can even remarry her. So apparently that original yibum, that's totally gone. The Gemara says, Hasam Nami over there also. Lema v'yivma adayin yivumin harishonim aleh. Why don't we say the original yibum is still there? Rashi over here says, Lema adayin yivumin harishonim aleh. Why don't we say the original yibum is still there? V'tibay chalitza, and chalitza is required. That's what the Gemara says. V'tibay chalitza, and chalitza should be required. And the Gemara says, no, Shani Hasam, it's different over there. Diyamar Kra, because the pasuk says, V'lagcha lo leisha. It says he takes her as a wife. Again, when you perform yibum, Kevon shalakacha, once he takes her, nasis ki ishto l'chol davar. She becomes like his halachic wife, like any other regular wife, follows all the regular halachos of gerushin with a get, etc. And so therefore, that's why it's different. But the Gemara says, if so, hachanami, why don't we say the same thing over here? Why do we say that in terms of the halacha of Eishes Achiv Shelo Haya Ba'olamo, there we do say that adayin yibumin harishonim aleh, that original yibum is still present, and we still say it's considered like it's coming somewhat from the first brother, and there's still a prohibition of Eishes Achiv Shelo Haya Ba'olamo, the fact that she was the wife of his brother and they weren't alive at the same time. And so to that the Gemara says, no, hakasav rachmana v'yibma. Pasuk says v'yibma. It was from that pasuk that we learned out that adayin yibumin harishonim aleha. But the Gemara says, Umar Isa, but how do you know that you should apply the pasuk in terms of Eishes Achiv Shelo Haya Ba'olamo, that it's a problem? But you don't apply the pasuk in terms of requiring chalitza from the second brother. And the Gemara answers very simply, Mistabra shadi hatera hatera, v'shadi isura aisura. It makes sense. Take something that's mutter and throw it on something that's already mutter. Take something that's usur and throw it on something that's already usur. As Rashi over here says, Shadi hatera lemidrash ulakacha delo tiboy chalitza. The ulakacha is telling us that you don't require chalitza. That's an idea of heter. A hatera hecha dekula milsa heter kagon b'miyavim eshasach. Let's throw that on the case where you're doing a regular mutter yibum. When the second brother who was alive at the same time as the first brother does yibum, that is hetera, that is a regular normal yibum. And over there we should say another heter, that you don't require chalitza. It's a full-fledged wife in all halachic regard. V'shadi isura lemedrash v'yivma adayin yivumin oleh. Now the isra of saying you still have the original presence of the yibum upon her, that's kind of an isser. Isura, put that on an isser. Heichadikot sad isser, where there's a side of isser, kemo be'eshes achiv shelo haya ba'olamo. Like in this case, by the third brother, where you have a potential problem of Eishes Achiv Shelo Haya Ba'olamo, we're going to say that's even a problem. If she first did Yibum with the second brother, maybe you would say that should remove the problem. No, the Isser is still over there, and we're going to say Adayin Yivumin Harishonim Aleh, and the Isser still remains. But the Gemara continues, Ula Rabbi Shimon, but according to Rabbi Shimon, Do Amar Hoa Luva Mitzah Beheter, that Rabbi Shimon has this logic that since when the brother was born, at that moment he finds her Beheter. V'lo Amda Olav Shas Shah Achas Be'Isser, and there wasn't a moment of Isser where she was in front of him, that allows it by the case of Eishes Achiv Shelo Haya Ba'olamo. In other words, when she already did Yibum with the second brother, so we ignore the fact that she was with the first brother and we say it's not a problem at all. So according to that logic, Ela Me'ata, but according to that, Achoso Me'imo, let's take the following case. Let's say a person has a sister from his mother's side, but he's not yet born. In other words, when he's going to be born, he's going to share a mother with this particular sister. Now obviously, you can't marry your sister. But in this case, Shenasa Achiv Me'aviv, what happens happened was this sister from his mother's side married his brother from his father's side. And afterwards he was born. Afterwards, this brother was born. Vames. And then that first brother that married his sister from his mother's side died. So in that case, Tisiyavim, that you should be able to do Yibum, because at the moment that he was born, he found her in Heter. In other words, the point is over here as follows. Obviously, you're not allowed to marry your sister from your mother's side. But in this case, by the time he was born, this sister from his mother's side was already married to his brother, and now it's a situation really of Eishes Ach and only of Yibum. And now he's born, his brother dies, so it should be mutter because it's just a case of Yibum, and the fact that he married that brother should remove the original Isser of Achos Imo. In other words, there was no moment where she stood before him, so to speak, in Isser. Why don't we say the same logic in that case? But the Gemara doesn't like it. The Gemara says, Isser Achos o lehechon azal. But that doesn't make any sense because the Isser of his sister hasn't went anywhere. Where did it go? Why should we say that just because she married his brother, therefore that Isser goes away? But the Gemara says, Hachanami. But here also, why don't we say the same logic? Isser achiv shelo haya ba'olam lehechon azal. Where did this Isser achiv shelo haya ba'olamo, where did that Isser go? The fact that the wife, the fact that the widow of the first brother married the second brother, now there's no problem of Eishes achiv shelo haya ba'olamo. But to that the Gemara says very simply, Hayisura de lesle hetera. Hayisura de isle hetera. One is a prohibition that there is no heter to it. Marrying your sister from your mother's side, there's no way to undo it. But when it comes to the wife of a brother, Yibum is a way to undo that isser. It's always usher to marry your brother's wife, but through Yibum is a heter. So over here, when the first brother dies and she goes to the second brother, and now it's Yibum from the second brother to the third brother, that can remove Eishes Ach, and it can also remove Eishes Achiv shelo haya ba'olamo. We'll take a look at Rashi over here. Achoso me'imo shenasa achiv me'aviv kodem leidaso. In other words, this sister from his mother's side married his brother from his father's side. Kodem leidaso shalzeh, before this kid was born. By the time he was born, she was already married to his brother. Tisiyavim lo. So we should allow Yibam. Keshayamazeh, when this brother dies that she's married to. Dam mitzah beheter Yibam, because he found her beheter Yibam. Isser achoso less leheter. And so then the Gemara says, no, the Isser achoso, there is no heter to it. Aval Isser eishes ach is leheter, keshe'ein lo banim. But there is a heter to Isser eishes ach in a situation, let's say, where the person dies with no children, then you have Yibam. Hilkach keshemeis rishon below banim. Therefore, when the first brother died without children, paka Isro lagabe sheni, his Isser went away lagabe, relevant to the second one. V'nasan, he married her. Vashlishi mikoach sheni ba. And then the third brother is coming from the strength of the second brother. So that's why in that case it's considered different than the case of his maternal sister. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Klal Amru b'Yevama, they have the following rule when it comes to Yevama, Kol shi Isser erva. Anytime the prohibition is erva, meaning if this woman that's falling before the brother is a situation of arayas, like we've said before, lo choletzes v'lo misyavemes. There's no chalitza and there is no yibam. Rashi over here says, lo choletzes v'lo misyavemes tzarasu. We're even talking about the co-wife, the kol shekain he, and certainly by she herself, certainly she will not do chalitza or yibam, as we've been saying all along, that's by Isser erva. Isser mitzvah v'isser kedusha. But if the Isser that she has to him, to this brother, is either an Isser mitzvah, that will be explained, or if it is an Isser kedusha, that will also be explained. So in those cases, choletzes v'lo misyavemes. In those cases, you do chalitza, but you do not do yibam. And the Mishnah continues. Achosa shehi yevamta. Let's say it's her sister, and it's also her sister-in-law. Choletzes o misyavemes. So the halach over there is you do chalitza or you do yibam. Rashi over here says, Achosa shel erva. Let's say it's the sister of the erva. Kishehi yevamta, meaning she's also her sister-in-law. Kegon shenaflu shtei achayus mishnei achim. We've had this case before. Let's say two sisters are married to two brothers, and the two brothers die. So now both sisters are falling to yibam, and they're also sisters-in-law. Ha'achas asura mishum erva. So one of them is going to be a problem, let's say, because of erva. Kegon shi kaloso chamoso. Let's say one of them happens to be the living brother's daughter-in-law or his mother-in-law. So that's the case over here where you have achosa shehi yevemta, their sister, which is sister-in-laws, but there's also an issue where one of them is an erva. Ocholetzes omas yavemes du chalitza or yibum. Achos erva, meaning the sister of the one that is erva. De lo paga b'achos zukukasu. This is not going to be a problem of marrying the sister of the zukuka. Misham de erva lav zukukasu, because the erva is not zukuka. In other words, normally when you have two sisters fall before you, so that could be a problem, because if you marry one of the sisters, now you're sort of marrying two sisters. If I take one sister in Yibum and the other one was Zakuka to me for Yibum, I kind of marry two sisters at once. But here it's not a problem, because as Rashi is explaining, one of them is an erva. So one of them doesn't even fall to the person to Yibum because it's an erva with him. So therefore the other sister, you can do chalitza or you can do Yibum. And the Mishnah continues, Isser Mitzvah. What is Isser Mitzvah? Shnios midivrei sofrim. It refers to secondary situations of arayas that are only asr on a derabanan level. And Isser Kedusha, what is Isser Kedusha? That would be the following cases. Almona l'kohen gadol. Let's say you have a case where the woman who's falling to Yibum is a widow and she's falling to a Kohen Gadol, or a Grusha v'chalutza l'Kohen Hedyot, you have a divorcee or a Chalutza falling to a Kohen Hedyot, or a Mamzeres u'nesina liYisrael, you have a Mamzeres and a Nesina liYisrael. All of these people are people that are not allowed to marry, Ubas Yisrael l'Nesin u'Mamzer, or you have a Bas Yisrael to a Nesin or to a Mamzer. All of these cases are prohibited types of relationships. Those are going to be referred to as Isser Kedusha. We'll take a look at Rashi over here. Shnios la'arayos. They're secondary to arayos. Shagazru sofer maleim of a gemar mefarshla. Refers to situations basically dirabanan. The Gemara is going to explain. Lashon mitzvah u'kedusha mefarsh begemar. The Gemara will explain why we're using the language of mitzvah and kedusha over here. Almana l'kohen gadol. The case would be as follows: Shemeis achiv hahedyo. Let's say his brother, who was a regular kohen, died. V'nafla almanusa lefanav. Now it's his widow falling, and happens to be he's a kohen gadol. He has a problem marrying an almana. That would be a case of Isser Kedusha. Again, the almana of his brother, who's a regular kohen, falls to him, and he happens to be a kohen gadol. Grusha v'chalutza l'kohen hedyot could be the following case: She'avar achiv hameis. Let's say his brother who died actually committed an aveira, did a transgression, v'nasa, and he married her even though she was a grusha, she was a divorcee. Now he dies and falls to the next kohen brother, and that's a problem. He can't marry a grusha. Chalutza ugrusha ucheshameis. Again, he married either a chalutza or it could be a grusha, either one. Ucheshameis, and when he dies, it's tzricha chalitza. So at that point, you're going to need chalitza. Sharei tovsim lo ba kiddushin, because really, even though it's prohibited to marry grusha and chalutza for a kohen, but the kiddushin actually does take effect. The kiddushin tovsim b'chai ve'lavin, because kiddushin is effective by chai ve'lavin. Avol yevume lo, but you shouldn't actually do the yibam sharei asura lo, because it is prohibited. Lezeshu kohen, because this guy is a kohen. Ve'ifturei bevelo klum, and therefore you can't let it go with nothing. Lo, that's no good. Lo alim lav, because it's just a lo sase here. That's not strong enough lemifter to make her potter. Tialfina me'achosisha perkama. That's what we learn out from achosisha, and so that's why in these cases where it's prohibited to do the yibam because it's a chai ve'lavin, but in theory, if you would do it, the kiddushin would be tovsin. So therefore, you should do chalitza and you should not do yibam. And we will just mention over here when it talks about a nesina and a nesin, that is a reference to the givonim. There was a prohibition to marry into the givonim that is discussed elsewhere. That's what it's referring to over here. And the Gemara says, Klal le'suye mai. When it says over here that there is a rule, the beginning of the Mishnah is Klal amru b'Yevamot. What does that come to include? Amar Rav from Bar Papa says, La'asuye tsaras ailanis uchid Ravasi. Comes to include the co-wife of an ailanis, as Ravasi says. Rashi over here says, La'asuye tsaras ailanis karavasi beparakama. We said this in the first parak. The lo choletzes v'lomes yavemis. We said by the co-wife of an ailanis. Let's say an ailanis falls to yibum, and then there's also a co-wife there. There's no chalitza and there's no yibum. The erva karinon ba ba'ailanis. It's called erva by an ailanis. The miyata krami asher teled. It says they have to be able to give birth. V'kaim oleh be'isr eshasach. Therefore, you go revert back to the original isr eshasach because there's no yibum. Helkach tzarasa tzaras erva. Therefore, her co-wife is a tzaras erva. That's the situation by tzaras ailanis. Again, that we said earlier. If it's a woman who's underdeveloped in terms of maturity, she's not able to have children, she's excluded from Yibam, and therefore goes back to the original prohibition of Eshesach. V'ika di'amri, some have another version as follows: Kol shi surah iser erva hu da'asira. Only where it's an iser erva is it really prohibited. Tzarasa, that's where we say that rather the co-wife is prohibited. Halo isura iser erva, but if it's not an iser erva, tzarasa lo asir, then the co-wife is not going to be prohibited. Lemute mai, what does that come to exclude? The exact opposite of what we said before. Amara from lemu'ute tzaras ailanis. It actually excludes the co-wife of an ailanis. The co-wife of an ailanis is not going to be also to do yibam. Udulo keravasi, and according to this, it would not follow ravasi. And the Gemara continues with the two dots. The Mishnah said achosa shehi yevamta, talking about a sister that's also a sister-in-law. And the Gemara says achosa deman. Who is this a sister of? Ilema de isser mitzvah. The case over here is that it's a sister of a situation of an isser mitzvah. In other words, it's not a full-fledged prohibition to marry this woman like an arayos. It's just a situation of Isser Mitzvah. It's an Isser Midrabanan. But if that's the case, Kevan to Midoraisa Ramya Kamei, if on a Doraisa level there really should be Yibam over here, so Paga Bachos Zakukaso, so then you do have a situation where really you have a situation of the sister of the Zakuk. On a Doraisa level, you can do Yibam with both women, and now if you're going to take one of the women, that's Achos Zakukaso, that's kind of like marrying two sisters. So that cannot be the case, and so the Gemara says exactly what Rashi said in the Mishnah, Ella Achosa de Isser Erva. Rather, what we're talking about over here is the sister of an Isser Erva. So therefore, the Isser Erva, that sister who is Erva, does not fall to Yibum at all, and therefore the other sister is fine to do Yibum. And the Gemara continues, Isser Mitzvah Shnios. What is Isser Mitzvah? That refers to the secondary Arayos, the Dirabonan Arayos. Amai Kori Le Isser Mitzvah. The Gemara asks, why is this called Isser Mitzvah? Why is this terminology used over here? Amar Abaya says, Mitzvah L'shmoa Divrei Chachamim, because it's a mitzvah to listen to the words of the Chachamim. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, quoting the Mishnah, Isser Kedusha. What are examples of Isser Kedusha? Almana l'kohen gadol, grusha v'chalutza l'kohen hedyot. Examples would be if an almana falls to yibum to a kohen gadol, or a grusha and chalutza fall to a kohen hedyot. And the Gemara says, V'amai kari lu Isser Kedusha. Why are these called Isser Kedusha? And so the Gemara says, Dechsiv, because the pasuk says, Kedoshim yiyu le'lokeim. You have to be holy. And the idea over here is quoting the pasuk of Kedoshim yiyu le'lokeim. So that's actually a reference to the Kohanim. That's a pasuk that's said by the Kohanim and calls them Kedoshim. And that's why, again, Almana l'kohen gadol, grusha v'chalutza l'kohen hedyot is called Isser Kedusha. And the Gemara continues, Tanya, we learned in a Braisa, Rabbi Yehuda machlef. Rabbi Yehuda actually switches around. Isser Mitzvah, Almana l'kohen gadol, grusha v'chalutza l'kohen hedyot. He uses the term Isser Mitzvah by an Almana l'kohen hedyot, by an Almana rather l'kohen gadol, and a grusha v'chalutza l'kohen hedyot. V'amai kari le Isser Mitzvah. Now, why does he call those Isser Mitzvah? Tichsiv, because the pasuk says, Eila ha-mitzvahs. It says, these are the mitzvahs. As Rashi over here says, Eila ha-mitzvahs besof sefer Torah's kohanim umashma dakula sifra koi. When it says these are the mitzvahs, it's going on the whole sefer. V'chol azharas kohanim hasam ksiva. This is where we find all the warnings against who the kohanim, what mitzvahs are upon the kohanim. These are some mitzvahs upon the kohanim, and therefore, since it uses the term eila ha-mitzvahs, so l'these are referred to almana l'kohen gadol, grusha v'chalutza l'kohen hedyot. They're referred to as Isser Mitzvah. And then Isser Kedusha, he has it switched around. Again, Isser Kedusha refers to shnios midivrei sofrim. It refers to the secondary arayos that are only derabanan. V'amai kori le Isser Kedusha. Now, why is it called Isser Kedusha? Amar Abaya says, Kol ha-mekayim divrei chachamim nikra kadosh, because anyone who fulfills the word of the chachamim is called kadosh. Amar le Rava, so Rava said to him, V'chol she'eno mekayim divrei chachamim, but somebody who's not mekayim divrei chachamim, kadosh hu de lo mikri, he's not called kadosh, but Rasha nami lo mikri, but he's not called a Rasha. That doesn't make sense. Elo Amar Rava, rather Rava says as follows, the reason why it's called Isser Kedusha is because kadesh atzmecha b'muterlach. You have to make yourself holy with things that were really mutter. In other words, you put a fence around the Torah, you create these derabbanans. Kadesh atzmecha lamod ulihizor. You have to be careful, af b'muterlach, even by that which is mutter. Lahosef aleim shnios, to add upon you these shnios, these derabbanans, ha-muterlach, which from the Torah are really mutter. Al harayos, add that onto the arayos, kadesh lo tavuli de arayos, hasuras min Torah. That way you will not come to arayos, which are forbidden from the Torah. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, almana l'kohen gadol. You have a case again of a widow falling to a kohen gadol, and the Gemara says, kapasuk v'tani lo shna min hanesuin v'lo shna min ha'erisin. It says it as a blanket statement. It doesn't matter if it's from nisuin or from erisin. Rashi over here says, kapasuk v'tani almana l'kohen gadol. We're talking about a case of a widow falling to a kohen gadol in yibum lo shna nafla l'fanav min hanesuin. It doesn't matter if she falls to him and she was actually married to the previous brother. Dahainu tarti l'grio, so that's doubly bad. Chada de almana. Number one, she's an almana, she's a widow. V'ika lav de almana lo yikach. There's a lav to take an almana. V'od de be'ulahi. And also, this is a woman who has had relations. She's not a basula, she's not a virgin. V'ika isra asay l'gabe. There's an isra asay to the kohen gadol. T'chsiv isha b'vsula yikach. It says that a kohen gadol has to marry a basula. V'lo be'ula, not a be'ula. V'lav haba mechlal asay asay. A negative commandment that's implied from a positive commandment, that really is considered a positive commandment. V'lo shna nafla l'fanav min ha'erisin. It doesn't matter if she felt him from erisin. V'od de basula, even if she's still a basula. The leka ela lav de almana. There you only have the los asay of almana. In other words, the Gemara is saying it seems to be problematic for the kohen gadol to do yibam with this woman, whether she was a be'ula or whether she was a basula. And the Gemara continues, b'shlamim in anesuin. I understand in a situation where she was married to the first brother, she's a be'ula. Asay velos asay. There you have a double problem, like we just said. You have a problem that he's violating an asay, he's not marrying a basula, and it's a problem of a los asay, he can't marry an almana. Vein asay docha los asay v'asay. So the asay of yibam can't come along and push off a los asay and an asay. Elamin ha'erisin, but if it's only from erisin, so she's a basula over here, and the only problem is Almana l'Kohen Gadol. So Los Aseh Greidu, it's just a Los Aseh, it's just one Los Aseh. Yavo Aseh, V'yidcha Los Aseh, the Aseh of Yivam should come along, and it should push off this Los Aseh. Why don't we say they should do Yibam? And the Gemara says, Amar Rav Gidel Amar Rav. Rav Gidel says in the name of Rav. Amar Kra, the pasuk says, "Vi also Yevemto Ashar." It says the Yevam is going to come by the gate. She'ein Talmud Lomar Yevemto. It doesn't even need to say the word Yevemto over here. That's an extra word. Ma Talmud Lomar Yevemto. Why does the pasuk over here say Yevemto? Yeishloch Yevama Achas She'ola L'Chalitza Ve'eina Ola L'Yibam. Because there's a kind of Yevama who she really should do Chalitza and she really shouldn't do Yibam. Ve'ezu Zu Chayvei Lavin. And what does this refer to? It refers to Chayvei Lavin. In other words, like a case over here where you'd be violating a lav if you're going to do the yibam, so it's better to do chalitza, and you should not do yibam. And we'll take a look at Rashi over here. V'osa ashara matzi lemichtav. It could have just said v'osa ashara. It didn't need the word yevimto. It's an extra word. Tachsib bereisha dekra lakachas says yevimto. Matam lomer yevimto. In the beginning of the pasuk it says yevimto. It doesn't need to say it again. So what does it mean? Yesh lach yevam. It means that there's a yevama that only has a possibility of chalitza and not yibam, and that's by chayvei lavin, as Rashi explains. The imkasav lo yachbotz ish lakachas says yevimto. If the pasuk just said that the person doesn't want to do yibam and then you go to the gate to do chalitza, have a mashma dahida karina beilakachas who become mitzvah chorachman of yosha shara lachlotz, then I would say that only by a woman who it's possible to do yibam is it also possible to choose instead to do chalitza. Aval chayvei lavin, but by chayvei lavin to lo karina bulakachas, where you're not supposed to marry chayvei lavin, lo karina and bavi also you don't have chalitza. Lahachi hadar kasav yevimto. That's the extra word of yevimto over here. Lemeimar to say the yesh loch yevama acheres, that there's a kind of a Yevama, Sha'ola Hashara Lachlotz, who does the Chalitza, V'afagav de Loksibol Akachas She'eno Ola Yibam, even though there's no Yibam, meaning there's no possibility of Yibam, because it's Chayvei Lavin. That's how we learn from this pasuk that by Chayvei Lavin you do Chalitza and you don't do Yibam. The Gemara says Ve'ema Chayvei Krisos, but how do I know the pasuk's talking about Chayvei Lavin? Maybe it's talking Chayvei Krisos. Rashi over here says Ema Chayvei Krisos Nami Leilaf Mihacha. Maybe also Chayvei Krisos. In other words, even if you learn Chayvei Lavin, but let's say the same thing by Chayvei Krisos, Chalitza, we should require at least chalitza by chayve krisos. Ve'amai patrina legamri, because we say by chayve krisos that they're pater from yibam and chalitza. Maybe chayve krisos should have to do chalitza. So to that the Gemara says, Amar Kra, the pasuk says, Lo yachbot seish lakachas hachafetz miyavim. No, the pasuk lo yachbot sounds like if he wanted to, he could do yibam, and we learn the exact opposite. Kala ola liyibam ola lechalitza. Only somebody who's fit for yibam does chalitza. V'chol she'en ola liyibam ein ola lechalitza. If they're not fit for yibam, they don't do chalitza, and that we apply to chayve krisos. Gemara says, well then, why don't we apply that to lavin? If that's the case, chayvei lavin say that since they can't do yibam, they can't do chalitza. So the Gemara says, Haravi rachmana yevimto. No, the pasuk had the extra word yevimto to teach us the other way. So you have to apply in one case, and you have to apply one scenario in the other case. Umaroi. So the Gemara says, well, how do you know how to apply which? How do you know that by chayvei lavin the chalitza is required, and that by chayvei krisos it is not required? And we'll continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Chaf Amud Beis.